Passover.
Passover, or Pesach, modern Hebrew, Pesach, Pesach. Yiddish, Pesach, 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 is an important biblically derived Jewish festival. The Jewish people celebrate Passover as a commemoration of their liberation over 3,300 years ago by God from slavery in ancient Egypt that was ruled by the pharaohs, and their freedom as a nation under the leadership of Moses. It commemorates the story of the Exodus as described in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the book of Exodus, in which the Israelites were freed from slavery in Egypt. Passover commences on the 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan and lasts for either 7 days, in Israel, or 8 days, in the diaspora. In Judaism, a day commences at dusk and lasts until the following dusk, thus the first day of Passover only begins after dusk of the 14th of Nisan and ends at dusk of the 15th day of the month of Nisan. The rituals unique to the Passover celebrations commence with the Passover Seder when the 15th of Nisan has begun. In the Northern Hemisphere, Passover takes place in spring as the Torah prescribes it, in the month of spring, bkhdsh by Exodus 23:15. It is one of the most widely observed Jewish holidays. In the narrative of the Exodus, the Bible tells that God helped the children of Israel escape from their slavery in Egypt by inflicting 10 plagues upon the ancient Egyptians before the Pharaoh would release his Israelite slaves. The 10th and worst of the plagues was the death of the Egyptian firstborn. The Israelites were instructed to mark the doorposts of their homes with the blood of a slaughtered spring lamb and, upon seeing this, the Spirit of the Lord knew to pass over the firstborn in these homes, hence the English name of the holiday. When the Pharaoh freed the Israelites, it is said that they left in such a hurry that they could not wait for bread dough to rise, leaven. In commemoration, for the duration of Passover no leavened bread is eaten, for which reason Passover was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the Torah or Old Testament. Thus matzo, flat unleavened bread, is eaten during Passover and it is a tradition of the holiday. Historically, together with Shavuot, Pentecost and Sukkot, Tabernacles, Passover is one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Shalosh Regalim, during which the entire population of the Kingdom of Judah made a pilgrimage to the Temple in Jerusalem. Samaritans still make this pilgrimage to Mount Gerizim, but only men participate in public worship.
Date and duration.
The Passover begins on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, which typically falls in March or April of the Gregorian calendar. Passover is a spring festival, so the 15th day of Nisan begins on the night of a full moon after the northern vernal equinox. To ensure that Passover did not start before spring, the tradition in ancient Israel held that the first day of Nisan would not start until the barley was ripe, being the test for the onset of spring. If the barley was not ripe, or various other phenomena indicated that spring was not yet imminent, an intercalary month, Adar II, would be added. However, since at least the 4th century, the date has been fixed mathematically. In Israel, Passover is the 7-day holiday of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, with the first and last days observed as legal holidays and as holy days involving abstention from work, special prayer services, and holiday meals. The intervening days are known as Kol HaMoed, weekdays the festival. Diaspora Jews historically observed the festival for 8 days, and most still do. Reform and Reconstructionist Jews and Israeli Jews, wherever they are, usually observe the holiday over 7 days. The reason for this extra day is due to enactment of the ancient Jewish sages. It is thought by many scholars that Jews outside of Israel could not be certain if their local calendars fully conformed to practice of the Temple at Jerusalem, so they added an extra day. But as this practice only attaches to certain, major, sacred days, others posit the extra day may have been added to accommodate people who had to travel long distances to participate in communal worship and ritual practices. Or the practice may have evolved as a compromise between conflicting interpretations of Jewish law regarding the calendar. Or it may have evolved as a safety measure in areas where Jews were commonly in danger, so that their enemies would not be certain on which day to attack. Karaites and Samaritans use different versions of the Jewish calendar, which are often out of sync with the modern Jewish calendar by 1 or 2 days. In 2009, for example, Nisan 15 on the Jewish calendar used by Rabbinic Judaism corresponds to April 9. On the calendars used by Karaites and Samaritans, Abib or Aviv 15, as opposed to Nisan corresponds to April 11 in 2009. The Karaite and Samaritan Passovers are each 1 day long, followed by the 6-day festival of unleavened bread, for a total of 7 days.
Biblical origin.
Called the festival the Matzos, Hebrew, Khghtmtsvt Hag HaMatzot, in the Hebrew Bible, the commandment to keep Passover is recorded in the book of Leviticus. The biblical regulations for the observance of the festival require that all leavening be disposed of before the beginning of the 15th of Nisan. An unblemished lamb or goat, known as the Korban Pesach or Paschal lamb, is to be set apart on Nisan 10, and slaughtered at dusk as Nisan 14 ends in preparation for the 15th of Nisan, when it will be eaten after being roasted. The literal meaning of the Hebrew is between the 2 evenings. It is then to be eaten at night, Nisan 15, roasted, without the removal of its internal organs, with unleavened bread, known as matzo, and bitter herbs known as ma. Nothing of the sacrifice on which the sun rises by the morning of the 15th of Nisan may be eaten, but must be burned. The sacrifices may only be performed in a specific place prescribed by God, for Judaism, Jerusalem, and for Samaritans, Mount Gerizim. The biblical regulations pertaining to the original Passover, at the time of the Exodus only, also include how the meal was to be eaten, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And ye shall eat it in haste, it is the Lord's Passover. Exodus 12:11. The biblical commandments concerning the Passover, and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, stress the importance of remembering. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in Egypt. And thou shalt observe and do these statutes. Deuteronomy 16:12, Exodus 12:14 commands, in reference to God's sparing of the firstborn from the 10th plague, and this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and ye shall keep it a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations ye shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. Exodus 13:3 repeats the command to remember, remember this day, in which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength the hand of the Lord brought you out from this place.
In extra-biblical sources.
Some of these details can be corroborated, and to some extent amplified, in extra-biblical sources. The removal, or sealing up of the leaven is referred to in the Elephantine Papyri, an Aramaic papyrus from 5th century BCE. Elephantine in Egypt. The slaughter of the lambs on the 14th is mentioned in the Book of Jubilees, a Jewish work of the Ptolemaic period, and by the Herodian-era writers Josephus and Philo. These sources also indicate that between the 2 evenings was taken to mean the afternoon. Jubilees states the sacrifice was eaten that night, and together with Josephus states that nothing of the sacrifice was allowed to remain until morning. Philo states that the banquet included hymns and prayers.
Etymology.
The English term Passover is first known to be recorded in the English language in William Tyndale's translation of the Bible, later appearing in the King James Version as well. The verb pausach, Hebrew, Pesach, is first mentioned in the Torah's account of the Exodus from Egypt, Exodus 12:23, and there is some debate about its exact meaning, the commonly held assumption that it means he passed over, pskh, in reference to God passing over, or skipping the houses of the Hebrews during the final of the 10 plagues of Egypt, stems from the translation provided in the Septuagint, paraloustai in Exodus 12:23, and iskepazin in Exodus 12:27. Targum Onkelos translates Pesach as he had pity. Judging from other instances of the verb, and instances of parallelism, a more faithful translation may be he hovered over, guarding. Indeed, this is the image invoked by the verb in Isaiah 31:5 as birds hovering, so will the Lord of hosts protect Jerusalem. He will deliver it as he protecteth it, he will rescue it as he passeth over, Kayat Cyprium Apvot, Kain Yagan Wyatt Hvahts at Bavot, Al Wyatt Rishlayim. Gain von Viet Hitzail, Pesach Viet him at Leite. Isaiah 31:5, both meanings become apparent in Exodus 12:23 when parsed as, The Lord will pass, hover, guard, over the door, and will not suffer the destroyer, destroying angel is commanded to pass by the children of Israel, to come in unto your houses to smite. The term Pesach, Hebrew, Pesach, may also refer to the lamb or goat which was designated as the Passover sacrifice, called the Korban Pesach in Hebrew. 4 days before the Exodus, the Hebrews were commanded to set aside a lamb. Exodus 12:3, and inspect it daily for blemishes. During the day on the 14th of Nisan, they were to slaughter the animal and use its blood to mark their lintels and doorposts. Up until midnight on the 15th of Nisan, they were to consume the lamb. On the night of the first Passover at the start of the original Exodus, each family, or group of families, gathered together to eat a meal that included the meat of the Korban Pesach while the 10th plague ravaged Egypt. During the existence of the tabernacle and later the temple in Jerusalem, the Passover offering, Hebrew Korban Pesach, was eaten during the Passover Seder on the 15th of Nisan. However, following the destruction of the temple, no sacrifices may be offered or eaten. The Seder Korban Pesach, a set of scriptural and rabbinic passages dealing with the Passover sacrifice, is customarily recited during or after the Mincha, afternoon prayer, service on the 14th on Nisan. The story of the Korban Pesach is also retold at the Passover Seder, the word Seder, SDR, meaning order, or arrangement, and one of the symbolic food items displayed, but not eaten, which represents it on the Seder plate is the zeroah, shank bone, or a chicken wing or neck.
Passover offering, Korban Pesach.
When the temple in Jerusalem was standing, the focus of the Passover festival was the Passover sacrifice, Hebrew Korban Pesach, also known as the Paschal Lamb. Every family large enough to completely consume a young lamb or wild goat was required to offer one for sacrifice at the Jewish temple on the afternoon of the 14th day of Nisan, Numbers 9:11, and eat it that night, which was the 15th of Nisan, Exodus 12:6. If the family was too small to finish eating the entire offering in one sitting, an offering was made for a group of families. The sacrifice could not be offered with anything leavened, Exodus 23:18, and had to be roasted, without its head, feet, or inner organs being removed, Exodus 12:9, and eaten together with unleavened bread, matzo, and bitter herbs, ma. One had to be careful not to break any bones from the offering, Exodus 12:46, and none of the meat could be left over by morning, Exodus 12:10. Exodus 23:18. Because of the Passover sacrifice's status as a sacred offering, the only people allowed to eat it were those who had the obligation to bring the offering. Among those who could not offer or eat the Passover lamb were an apostate, Exodus 12:43, a servant, Exodus 12:45, an uncircumcised man, Exodus 12:48, a person in a state of ritual impurity, except when a majority of Jews are in such a state, Psalm 66b, and a non-Jew. The offering had to be made before a quorum of 30, Psalm 64b. In the temple, the Levites sang Hallel while the priests performed the sacrificial service. Men and women were equally obligated regarding the offering, Psalm 91b. Women were obligated, as men, to perform the Korban Pesach and to participate in a Seder.
Today,
in the absence of the temple, the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach is memorialized in the Seder Korban Pesach, recited in the afternoon of Nisan 14, and in the form of symbolic food placed on the Passover Seder plate, which is usually a roasted shank bone. The eating of the afikomen substitutes for the eating of the Korban Pesach at the end of the Seder meal, Mishnah Pesachim 119a. Many Sephardi Jews have the custom of eating lamb or goat meat during the Seder in memory of the Korban Pesach.
removing all chametz.
Chametz, KHMTS, leavening is made from one of 5 types of grains combined with water and left to stand for more than 18 minutes. The consumption, keeping, and owning of chametz is forbidden during Passover. Yeast and fermentation are not themselves forbidden as seen for example by wine, which is required, rather than merely permitted. According to Halakha, the ownership of such chametz is also prescribed. chametz does not include baking soda, baking powder or like products. Although these are defined in English as leavening agents, they leaven by chemical reaction, not by biological fermentation. Thus, bagels, waffles and pancakes made with baking soda and matzo meal are considered permissible, while bagels made with sourdough and pancakes and waffles made with yeast are prohibited. The Torah commandments regarding chametz are to remove all chametz from one's home, including things made with chametz, before the first day of Passover. Exodus 12:15. It may be simply used up, thrown out, historically, destroyed by burning, or given or sold to non-Jews, or non-Samaritans, as the case may be, to refrain from eating chametz or mixtures containing chametz during Passover. Exodus 13:3, Exodus 12:20, Deuteronomy 16:3, not to possess chametz in one's domain, that is home, office, car, etc. during Passover, Exodus 12:19, Deuteronomy 16:4. Observant Jews spend the weeks before Passover in a flurry of thorough house cleaning, to remove every morsel of chametz from every part of the home. Jewish law requires the elimination of olive-sized or larger quantities of leavening from one's possession, but most housekeeping goes beyond this. Even the cracks of kitchen counters are thoroughly scrubbed, for example, to remove any traces of flour and yeast, however small. Any item or implement that has handled chametz is generally put away and not used during Passover. Some hotels, resorts, and even cruise ships across America, Europe and Israel also undergo a thorough house cleaning to make their premises kosher for Pesach to cater to observant Jews.
Interpretations for abstinence from leaven or yeast.
Some scholars suggest that the command to abstain from leavened food or yeast suggests that sacrifices offered to God involve the offering of objects in their least altered state, that would be nearest to the way in which they were initially made by God. According to other scholars, the absence of leaven or yeast means that leaven or yeast symbolizes corruption and spoiling. In any case, the main entity in Passover according to Judaism is the sacrificial lamb. Additionally, there is a tradition of not eating matzo, flat unleavened bread, in the 30 days before Passover begins so that there will be an increased appetite for it during Passover itself.
Sale of chametz.
Chametz may be sold rather than discarded, especially in the case of relatively valuable forms such as liquor distilled from wheat, with the products being repurchased afterward. In some cases, they may never leave the house, instead being formally sold while remaining in the original owner's possession in a locked cabinet until they can be repurchased after the holiday. Modern observance may also include sealing cabinets and drawers which contain chametz shut by using adhesive tape, which serves a similar purpose to a lock but also shows evidence of tampering. Although the practice of selling chametz dates back many years, some contemporary rabbinical authorities have come to regard it with disdain, since the supposed new owner never takes actual possession of the goods. The sale of chametz may also be conducted communally via a rabbi, who becomes the agent for all the community's Jews through a halakhic procedure called a kinyan, acquisition. Each householder must put aside all the chametz he is selling into a box or cupboard, and the rabbi enters into a contract to sell all the chametz to a non-Jew, who is not obligated to observe the commandments, in exchange for a small down payment, for example $1, with the remainder due after Passover. This sale is considered completely binding according to halakha, and at any time during the holiday, the buyer may come to take or partake of his property. The rabbi then repurchases the goods for less than they were sold at the end of the holiday.
Search for leaven.
On the night of the 14th of Nisan, the night before the Passover Seder, after nightfall on the evening before Passover Eve, Jews do a formal search in their homes known as Bedikat chametz for any possible remaining leaven, chametz. The Talmudic sages instructed that a search for chametz be made in every home, place of work, or any place where chametz may have been brought during the year. When the first Seder is on a Saturday night, the search is conducted on the preceding Thursday night, 13th of Nisan. The Talmud in Pesachim, p. 2a, derives from the Torah that the search for chametz be conducted by the light of a candle and therefore is done at night, and although the final destruction of the chametz, usually by burning it in a small bonfire, is done on the next morning, the blessing is made at night because the search is both in preparation for and part of the commandments to remove and destroy all chametz from one's possession.
Blessing for search of chametz and nullification of chametz.
Before the search is begun there is a special blessing. If several people or family members assist in the search, then only one person, usually the head of that family, recites the blessing, having in mind to include everyone present. In Hebrew: BRVKTHYHVLMSHRQDSHNVBMTSVTYVVTSVNVLBVRKHMTS. The search is then usually conducted by the head of the household joined by his family, including children, under the supervision of their parents. It is customary to turn off the lights and conduct the search by candlelight, using a feather and a wooden spoon. Candlelight effectively illuminates corners without casting shadows. The feather can dust crumbs out of their hiding places. And the wooden spoon which collects the crumbs can be burned the next day with the chametz. However, most contemporary Jewish Orthodox authorities permit using a flashlight, while some strongly encourage it due to the danger coupled with using a candle. Because the house is assumed to have been thoroughly cleaned by the night before Passover, there is some concern that making a blessing over the search for chametz will be in vain, bracha levitala, if nothing is found. Thus, 10 morsels of bread or cereal smaller than the size of an olive are traditionally hidden throughout the house in order to ensure that some chametz will be found. Upon conclusion of the search, with all the small pieces safely wrapped up and put in one bag or place, to be burned the next morning, the following is said. Original declaration is recited in Aramaic. Drive.
Morning of 14th of Nisan. Fast of the Firstborn.
On the morning of the Passover Seder, firstborn sons are commanded to observe the fast of the firstborn, which commemorates the salvation of the Hebrew firstborns. According to Exodus 12:29, God struck down all Egyptian firstborns while the Israelites were not affected. However, it is customary for synagogues to conduct a Sayyum, ceremony marking the completion of a section of Torah learning, right after morning prayers, and the celebratory meal that follows cancels the firstborn's obligation to fast.
Burning and nullification of chametz.
On the morning of the 14th of Nisan, any leavened products that remain in the householder's possession, along with the 10 morsels of bread from the previous night's search, are burned, sreifat chametz. The head of the household repeats the declaration of Bilyat chametz, declaring any chametz that may not have been found to be null and void as the dust of the earth. Original declaration is recited in Aramaic. Drive. Should more chametz actually be found in the house during the Passover holiday, it must be burnt as soon as possible. Unlike chametz, which can be eaten any day of the year except during Passover, kosher for Passover foods can be eaten year-round. They need not be burnt or otherwise discarded after the holiday ends. The historic Paschal Lamb Passover sacrifice, Korban Pesach, has not been brought following the Romans' destruction of the Second Jewish Temple approximately 2,000 years ago, and it is therefore still not part of the modern Jewish holiday. However, the Paschal Lamb is still a principal feature of full Asher, Karaite and Samaritan observance. In the times when the Jewish temple stood, the lamb was slaughtered and cooked on the evening of Passover and was completely consumed before the morning as described in Exodus 12:3-11.
Separate kosher for Passover utensils and dishes.
Due to the Torah injunction not to eat chametz during Passover, Exodus 12:15, observant families typically own complete sets of serving dishes, glassware and silverware, and in some cases, even separate dishwashers and sinks. which have never come into contact with chametz, for use only during Passover. Under certain circumstances, some chametz utensils can be immersed in boiling water, hagalat kilim, to purge them of any traces of chametz that may have accumulated during the year. Many Sephardic families thoroughly wash their year-round glassware and then use it for Passover, as the Sephardic position is that glass does not absorb enough traces of food to present a problem. Similarly, ovens may be used for Passover either by setting the self-cleaning function to the highest degree for a certain period of time, or by applying a blowtorch to the interior until the oven glows red hot, a process called Lieben Gamma.
Matzah.
A symbol of the Passover holiday is matzo, an unleavened flatbread made solely from flour and water which is continually worked from mixing through baking, so that it is not allowed to rise. Matzo may be made by machine or by hand. The latter type of matzo, called shmura matzo, watched, or guarded matzo, is the bread of preference for the Passover Seder in Orthodox Jewish communities. The Torah contains a divine commandment to eat matzo, specifically, on the first night of Passover and to eat only unleavened bread, in practice, matzo, during the entire week of Passover. Consequently the eating of matzo figures prominently in the Passover Seder. There are several explanations for this. The Torah says that it is because the Hebrews left Egypt with such haste that there was no time to allow baked bread to rise. Thus flat, unleavened bread, matzo, is a reminder of the rapid departure of the Exodus. Other scholars teach that in the time of the Exodus, matzo was commonly baked for the purpose of traveling because it preserved well and was light to carry, making it similar to hardtack, suggesting that matzo was baked intentionally for the long journey ahead. Matzo has also been called lechemani, Hebrew, bread of poverty. There is an attendant explanation that matzo serves as a symbol to remind Jews what it is like to be a poor slave and to promote humility, appreciate freedom, and avoid the inflated ego symbolized by more luxurious leavened bread. In the weeks before Passover, matzos are prepared for holiday consumption. In Orthodox Jewish communities, men traditionally gather in groups, shabbaras, to bake a special version of handmade matzo called shmura matzo, or guarded matzo, for use at the Seder. These are made from wheat that is guarded from contamination by chametz from the time of summer harvest to its baking into matzos 5 to 10 months later. Shmura matzo dough is rolled by hand, resulting in a large and round matzo. Shabbaras also work together in machine-made matzo factories, which produce the typically square-shaped matzo sold in stores. The baking of shmura matzo is labor-intensive, as only 18 to 22 minutes is permitted between the mixing of flour and water to the conclusion of baking and removal from the oven. However, most are completed within 5 minutes of being kneaded. Consequently, only a small number of matzos can be baked at one time, and the shabbara members are enjoined to work the dough constantly so that it is not allowed to ferment and rise. A special cutting tool is run over the dough just before baking to prick any bubbles which might make the matzah puff up. This creates the familiar dotted holes in the matzo. After the matzos come out of the oven, the entire work area is scrubbed down and swept to make sure that no pieces of old, potentially leavened dough remain, as any stray pieces are now chametz, and can contaminate the next batch of matzo.
Passover Seder.
It is traditional for Jewish families to gather on the first night of Passover, first 2 nights in communities outside the land of Israel, for a special dinner called a Seder, SDR, derived from the Hebrew word for order, referring to the very specific order of the ritual. The table is set with the finest china and silverware to reflect the importance of the meal. During this meal, the story of the Exodus from Egypt is retold using a special text called the Haggadah. 4 cups of wine are consumed at various stages in the narrative. The Haggadah divides the night's procedure into 15 parts. Kaddish Qdsh, recital of Kiddush, blessing and drinking of the first cup of wine, Urcharts Vrkhts, the washing of the hands, without blessing, Karpas Krps, dipping of the karpas in salt water, Yasharts Ykhts, breaking the middle matzo. The larger piece becomes the afikoman, which is eaten later during the ritual of Zafun, Megadem Gyd, retelling the Passover story, including the recital of the 4 questions, and drinking of the second cup of wine, Rkhtsh, second washing of the hands, with blessing, Motzi Mvtsy, traditional blessing before eating bread products, Matzo Mtsh, blessing before eating matzo, Mar Mrvr, eating of the mar, Krik Kvrk, eating of a sandwich made of matzo and mar, Shulchan Arik Shvlkhnvrk, Litz at table, the serving of the holiday meal, Zafun Tspvn, eating of the afikoman, Barak Brk, blessing after the meal and drinking of the third cup of wine, Hillel Hll, recital of the Hillel, traditionally recited on festivals. Drinking of the fourth cup of wine, Nurtza Nytsh, conclusion. These 15 parts parallel the 15 steps in the temple in Jerusalem on which the Levites stood during temple services, and which were memorialized in the 15 Psalms, number 120-134, known as Shir HaMelot, Hebrew, Shir HMLVT, Songs of Ascent. The Seder is replete with questions, answers, and unusual practices, for example the recital of Kiddush, which is not immediately followed by the blessing over bread, which is the traditional procedure for all other holiday meals, to arouse the interest and curiosity of the children at the table. The children are also rewarded with nuts and candies when they ask questions and participate in the discussion of the Exodus and its aftermath. Likewise, they are encouraged to search for the afikoman, the piece of matzah which is the last thing eaten at the Seder. Audience participation and interaction is the rule, and many families' Seders last long into the night with animated discussions and much singing. The Seder concludes with additional songs of praise and faith printed in the Haggadah, including Chad Gadiah, One Little Kid, or One Little Goat.
Maror.
Mar symbolizes the bitterness of slavery in Egypt. The following verse from the Torah underscores that symbolism, and they embittered, Vymrv, there lives with hard labor, with mortar and with bricks and with all manner of labor in the field. Any labor that they made them do was with hard labor, Exodus 1:14.
4 cups of wine.
There is a rabbinic requirement that 4 cups of wine are to be drunk during the Seder meal. This applies to both men and women. The Mishnah says, Pes 10:1, that even the poorest man in Israel has an obligation to drink. Each cup is connected to a different part of the Seder. The first cup is for Kiddush, the second cup is connected with the recounting of the Exodus, the drinking of the third cup concludes Birkat Hamazon, and the fourth cup is associated with Hillel.
The 4 questions and participation of children.
Children have a very important role in the Passover Seder. Traditionally the youngest child is prompted to ask questions about the Passover Seder, beginning with the words, Ma nishtena halayla hazi, why is this night different from all other nights? The questions encourage the gathering to discuss the significance of the symbols in the meal. The questions asked by the child are: often the leader of the Seder and the other adults at the meal will use prompted responses from the Haggadah, which states, the more one talks about the Exodus from Egypt, the more praiseworthy he is. Many readings, prayers, and stories are used to recount the story of the Exodus. Many households add their own commentary and interpretation, and often the story of the Jews is related to the theme of liberation and its implications worldwide.
Afikoman.
The afikoman, an integral part of the Seder itself, is used to engage the interest and excitement of the children at the table. During the fourth part of the Seder, called Yashatz, the leader breaks the middle piece of matzah into 2. He sets aside the larger portion as the afikoman. Many families use the afikoman as a device for keeping the children awake and alert throughout the Seder proceedings by hiding the afikoman and offering a prize for its return. Alternatively, the children are allowed to steal the afikoman and demand a reward for its return. In either case, the afikoman must be consumed during the 12th part of the Seder, Zafun.
Concluding songs.
After the Hillel, the 4th glass of wine is drunk, and participants recite a prayer that ends in next year in Jerusalem. This is followed by several lyric prayers that expound upon God's mercy and kindness, and give thanks for the survival of the Jewish people through a history of exile and hardship. Echad Miyudea, Who Knows One, is a playful song, testing the general knowledge of the children, and the adults. Some of these songs, such as Chad Gadaya, are allegorical.
Counting of the Omer.
Beginning on the second night of Passover, the 16th day of Nisan, Jews begin the practice of the counting of the Omer, a nightly reminder of the approach of the holiday of Shavuot 50 days hence. Each night after the evening prayer service, men and women recite a special blessing and then enumerate the day of the Omer. On the first night, for example, they say, "Today is the first day in," or, "2, the Omer." On the second night, "Today is the second day in the Omer." The counting also involves weeks. Thus, the seventh day is commemorated, "Today is the seventh day," which is 1 week in the Omer. The eighth day is marked, "Today is the eighth day," which is 1 week and 1 day in the Omer, etc. When the temple stood in Jerusalem, a sheaf of new cut barley was presented before the altar on the second day of unleavened bread. Josephus writes, "Since the destruction of the temple, this offering is brought in word rather than deed." One explanation for the counting of the Omer is that it shows the connection between Passover and Shavuot. The physical freedom that the Hebrews achieved at the Exodus from Egypt was only the beginning of a process that climaxed with the spiritual freedom they gained at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. Another explanation is that the newborn nation which emerged after the Exodus needed time to learn their new responsibilities vis-à-vis Torah and mitzvot before accepting God's law. The distinction between the Omer offering, a measure of barley, typically animal fodder, and the Shavuot offering, 2 loaves of wheat bread, human food, symbolizes the transition process.
Hol Hamoud, the intermediate days of Passover.
In Israel, Passover lasts for 7 days, with the first and last days being major Jewish holidays. In Orthodox and conservative communities, no work is performed on those days, with most of the rules relating to the observances of Shabbat being applied. A Seder is held on the first day. Outside Israel, in Orthodox and conservative communities, the holiday lasts for 8 days, with the first 2 days and last 2 days being major holidays. A Seder is conducted twice, on both the first and second days. In the intermediate days necessary work can be performed. Reform Judaism observes Passover over 7 days, with the first and last days being a major holidays. The Seder is held on the first day. Like the holiday of Sukkot, the intermediary days of Passover are known as Kol HaMoed, festival weekdays, and are imbued with a semi-festive status. It is a time for family outings and picnic lunches of matzo, hard-boiled eggs, fruits and vegetables, and Passover treats such as macaroons and homemade candies. Passover cake recipes call for potato starch or Passover cake flour made from finely granulated matzo instead of regular flour, and a large amount of eggs to achieve fluffiness. Cookie recipes use matzo farfel, broken bits of matzo, or ground nuts as the base. For families with Eastern European backgrounds, borscht, a soup made with beets, is a Passover tradition. While kosher for Passover packaged goods are available in stores, some families opt to cook everything from scratch during Passover week. In Israel, families that do not kasher their ovens can bake cakes, casseroles, and even meat on the stove top in a wonder pot, an Israeli invention consisting of 3 parts, an aluminium pot shaped like a bundt pan, a hooded cover perforated with venting holes, and a thick, round, metal disc with a center hole which is placed between the wonder pot and the flame to disperse heat.
7th day of Passover.
Shvi Shel Pesach, Shbyy Shlpskh, 7th of Passover is another full Jewish holiday, with special prayer services and festive meals. Outside the land of Israel and the Jewish diaspora, Shvi Shel Pesach is celebrated on both the 7th and 8th days of Passover. This holiday commemorates the day the children of Israel reached the Red Sea and witnessed both the miraculous splitting of the sea, the drowning of all the Egyptian chariots, horses and soldiers that pursued them, and the passage of the Red Sea. According to the Midrash, only the Pharaoh was spared to give testimony to the miracle that occurred. Hasidic Rebs traditionally hold a tish on the night of Shvi Shel Pesach and place a couple bowl of water on the table before them. They use this opportunity to speak about the splitting of the sea to their disciples, and sing songs of praise to God.
Second Passover.
The second Passover, Pesach Sheni, on the 14th of Iyar in the Hebrew calendar is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible, Numbers 9:6-13, as a make-up day for people who were unable to offer the Pesach sacrifice at the appropriate time due to ritual impurity or distance from Jerusalem. Just as on the first Pesach night, breaking bones from the second Paschal offering, Numbers 9:12, or leaving meat over until morning, Numbers 9:12, is prohibited. Today, Pesach Sheni on the 14th of Iyar has the status of a very minor holiday, so much so that many of the Jewish people have never even heard of it, and it essentially does not exist outside of Orthodox and traditional conservative Judaism. There are not really any special prayers or observances that are considered Jewish law. The only change in the liturgy is that in some communities Tachanun, a penitential prayer omitted on holidays, is not said. There is a custom, though not Jewish law, to eat just one piece of matzah on that night.
Traditional foods.
Because the house is free of chametz for 8 days, the Jewish household typically eats different foods during the week of Passover. Some include Ashkenazi foods. Matzah brie, softened matzah fried with egg and fat. Served either savory or sweet, matzah kugel, a kugel made with matzah instead of noodles. Ashkenazi cuisine, karoset, a sweet mixture of fruit, fresh, dried or both. Nuts, spices and sometimes wine. The karoset is a symbol of the clay the Israelites worked in while being slaves in Egypt. See Passover Seder, train, horseradish and beet relish. A type of mar. Ashkenazi cuisine, grilled fish, poached fish patties or fish balls made from a mixture of ground deboned fish, mostly carp or pike. Ashkenazi cuisine, chicken soup with matzah balls, nidlach, chicken soup served with matzah meal dumplings, kaftikas de praza, fried balls made of leeks, meat and matzah meal. Sephardic cuisine, lamb or chicken leg, a symbol of God's strong hand, and korban hatzich, minor, pastel de pesach, a meat pie made with matzos. Sephardic cuisine, spring green vegetables, artichoke, fava beans, peas.
Sermons, liturgy, and song.
The story of Passover, with its message that slaves can go free, and that the future can be better than the present, has inspired a number of religious sermons, prayers, and songs, including spirituals, what used to be called Negro spirituals, within the African American community. Rabbi Philip R. Allstadt, an early leader of conservative Judaism, known for his fiery rhetoric and powerful oratory skills, wrote and spoke in 1939 about the power of the Passover story during the rise of Nazi persecution and terror.
Influence on other religions. Christianity.
The Christian feast of Maundy Thursday finds its roots in the Jewish feast of Passover, the night on which the Last Supper is generally thought to have occurred.
Islam.
In Islam, Sunni Muslims fast on the day of Ashura, the 10th day of Muharram, based on narrations attributed to Muhammad. The fasting is to commemorate the day when Moses and his followers were saved from Pharaoh by Allah by creating a path in the Red Sea, that is, the Exodus. According to Muslim tradition, the Jews of Medina used to fast on the 10th day in observance of Passover. As Muslims revere the Israelites, Muhammad recommended to fast this day but be different from the Jews and recommended fasting 2 days instead of one. 9th and 10th or the 10th and 11th day of Muharram. Passover celebrations commence with the Passover Seder when the 15th of Nisan has begun. In the Northern Hemisphere, Passover takes place in spring as the Torah prescribes it, in the month of spring, BKHDSH by Exodus 23:15. It is one of the most widely observed Jewish holidays. In the narrative of the Exodus, the Bible tells that God helped the children of Israel escape from their slavery in Egypt by inflicting 10 plagues upon the ancient Egyptians before the Pharaoh would release his Israelite slaves. The 10th and worst of the plagues was the death of the Egyptian firstborn. The Israelites were instructed to mark the doorposts of their homes with the blood of a slaughtered spring lamb and, upon seeing this, the Spirit of the Lord knew to pass over the firstborn in these homes, hence the English name of the holiday. When the Pharaoh freed the Israelites, it is said that they left in such a hurry that they could not wait for bread dough to rise, leaven. In commemoration, for the duration of Passover no leavened bread is eaten, being the test for the onset of spring. If the barley was not ripe, or various other phenomena indicated that spring was not yet imminent, an intercalary month, Adar II, would be added. However, since at least the 4th century, the date has been fixed mathematically. In Israel, Passover is the 7-day holiday of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, with the first and last days observed as legal holidays and as holy days involving abstention from work, special prayer services, and holiday meals. The intervening days are known as Kol HaMoed, weekdays the festival. Diaspora Jews historically observed the festival for 8 days, and most still do. Reform and Reconstructionist Jews and Israeli Jews, wherever they are, usually observe the holiday over 7 days. The reason for this extra day is due to enactment of the ancient Jewish sages. It is thought by many scholars that Jews outside of Israel could not be certain if their local calendars fully conformed to practice of the template, for which reason Passover was called the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the Torah or Old Testament. Thus matzo, flat unleavened bread, is eaten during Passover and it is a tradition of the holiday. Historically, together with Shavuot, Pentecost and Sukkot, Tabernacles, Passover is one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Shalosh Regalim, during which the entire population of the Kingdom of Judah made a pilgrimage to the Temple in Jerusalem. Samaritans still make this pilgrimage to Mount Gerizim, but only men participate in public worship.
Date and duration.
The Passover begins on the 15th day of the month of Nisan, which typically falls in March or April of the Gregorian calendar. Passover is a spring festival, so the 15th day of Nisan begins on the night of a full moon after the northern vernal equinox. To ensure that Passover did not start before spring, the tradition in ancient Israel held that the first day of Nisan would not start until the barley was ripe.
Passover.
Passover, or Pesach, modern Hebrew, Pesach, Pesach. Yiddish, Pesach, 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 is an important biblically derived Jewish festival. The Jewish people celebrate Passover as a commemoration of their liberation over 3,300 years ago by God from slavery in ancient Egypt that was ruled by the pharaohs, and their freedom as a nation under the leadership of Moses. It commemorates the story of the Exodus as described in the Hebrew Bible, especially in the book of Exodus, in which the Israelites were freed from slavery in Egypt. Passover commences on the 15th of the Hebrew month of Nisan and lasts for either 7 days, in Israel, or 8 days, in the diaspora. In Judaism, a day commences at dusk and lasts until the following dusk, thus the first day of Passover only begins after dusk of the 14th of Nisan and ends at dusk of the 15th day of the month of Nisan. The ritual's unique to the part of Jerusalem, so they added an extra day. But as this practice only attaches to certain, major, sacred days, others posit the extra day may have been added to accommodate people who had to travel long distances to participate in communal worship and ritual practices. Or the practice may have evolved as a compromise between conflicting interpretations of Jewish law regarding the calendar. Or it may have evolved as a safety measure in areas where Jews were commonly in danger, so that their enemies would not be certain on which day to attack. Karaites and Samaritans use different versions of the Jewish calendar, which are often out of sync with the modern Jewish calendar by 1 or 2 days. In 2009, for example, Nisan 15 on the Jewish calendar used by Rabbinic Judaism corresponds to April 9th. On the calendars used by Karaites and Samaritans, Abib or Aviv 15, as opposed to Nisan corresponds to April 11th in 2009. The Karaite and Samaritan Passovers are each 1 day long,